Hello, and welcome to the first discussion series of Buda Nights. I am Homira Rezai, playwright, actor, and director. In 2005, I co-founded Simorgh Film Association of Culture and Art in Herat, west of Afghanistan. March 11, 2013, I co-founded A Night with Buda Festival to commemorate the destruction of World Cultural Heritage, the Buddha statues of Bamyan. The destruction of Buddha statues in 2001, which carried out in the continuation of decades of ethnic cleansing with the aim of destroying the history of Hazara people, was beyond massacre. It was a cultural genocide. 20 years later, after the destruction, even the remains, the empty niche of Buddha statues, are again in danger in Bamyan. This year, we at Teater, with collaboration of Safe Haven Freedom Talks, arrange a series of discussion to understand the different aspects of destruction of cultural heritage, destroying history, forced forgetting, social discrimination, and genocide against Hazara people. Unfortunately, we miss one of our guests, Sajjad Askary, and I hope that we can have him with us in the next session. But today with us, we have Dr. Homira Rezai. She is the Executive Operation Lead at Mirzim and the Chair of the Hazara Committee in the UK. Dr. Homira advocates for the rights of Hazaras in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Through her work, she has written several reports and parliamentary briefs on the Hazaras, providing accurate information on what is really happening on the ground. Homira was one of the organizers who co-led the hashtag Stop Hazara Genocide campaign, which has increased the conversation on the persecution of Hazaras in Afghanistan. This hashtag was trended many times, including yesterday in Twitter. This session, which will be moderated by Asad Buda. Asad Buda is a freelance writer. He studied sociology and Islamic theology, and he has worked as researcher and university lecturer in Kabul. He is the former Icon guest writer in Karlstad. Det återvändande ögat, a chapter of his personal memoir, was published in Varmland Writers Anthology. He has worked with Teater and Teater on a project called Little History, resulting in publishing a book under the title of Hoppets Territorium. Southern Stars and Homo Saker och Fåglarna på Linjegatan are his last published text in Ord och Bild and Govet Brewster Art Gallery. He is also involved in visual art, focusing on the demonization of political enemies and aesthetic aspect of extremist and religious violence. Thank you, dear Homira, for being with us. And now I leave the platform for you and Asad. Thank you.
Thank you, Munira, and welcome, and Freedom Talks, Teater and Safe Haven. Thank you, Homira, for joining us into this meeting. Unfortunately, we missed Sajjad Askary. I hope he can join us during the meeting. So the title we are going to talk today is Unjust Narrative and the Absence of Hazara People in the public discussion. So, and the idea is the discrimination, the social discrimination has a language aspect, and it's come from the order of speech. And so first, the discriminations started from a kind of narrative and then implemented into the people. So if we go back to the little background of this topic for Hazara people, so it's started usually at the end of 19th century. So it was the first time that the Hazara people classified. So as a Hazara, so they reduced to the Shia because Hazara are Shia, Sunni, Ismaili, so they are come from different religion. But at the first time, at the end of 19th century, during the Abdul Rahman time, Hazara people categorized and classified and reduced to Shia. So, and then should create a kind of symbols to humiliate the Hazara people and to justify the discrimination. They dehumanized Hazara. If we go back to the history during the Abdul Rahman time, so when they are talking about the Hazara people, they are talking as a Yaghi people, as a rebel, as an infidel people. So, and then based off this discussion, so he on that time, the Abdurrahman government created a narrative to justify the killing of Hazara people and pluralize the society. And then after it's led to a very biggest genocide between 1892 and 1893. 62% of Hazara people has been killed, and 64% of Hazara people land occupied, and they missed their land, they forced displaced, and then so this discrimination continue. But what's happened after genocide? So and then this the biggest genocide in the human history, denied by government and by other people who committed the genocide. So, so now we are going to talk about how this kind of narrative influenced the Hazara people, and how it's a kind of unjust narrative. It influenced even Hazara people life in today. So 2 days ago happened the one of dangerous suicide attack in Kabul, in Dashti Barchi, but there is no discussion about that. So there is no media to cover that. So we are invited guests to talk about this topic. I'm welcoming Homira.
Thank you so much, Asad. Thank you for the organizing parties for this very timely and very important conversation that we're having, especially what's happened this week, these targeted attacks against the Hazaras. As you rightly said, the unjust narrative is something not only led to the genocide of Hazaras, but actually led to the continuation of these genocides, discrimination and oppression. And as we can see that evidence, especially the increase of violence that we see against the Hazara community under the Taliban regime. And I think most often we undermine the power of unjust narrative. Because the unjust narrative not only is within the perpetrators' community, but also it infiltrates into, in this case, the Hazara community. And a lot of times you mentioned that the Hazaras were divided and categorized as Shias, and Shiism is used to justify their killing. And unfortunately, this narrative has infiltrated even the Hazara community, in which they believe that the reason they're getting killed is because of their religious sect. We often forget that the campaign that the state of Afghanistan back in the 1700s had against the Hazaras was a lot of this. And I think it wasn't successful until when they said that Hazaras are Shias and Shias are infidels, and therefore if you commit just jihad against the Hazaras, then or against the Shias, then it's all right, and they allowed that. And this was something that led not only the soldiers at that time, the trained soldiers who went on to fight against the Hazaras, but also normal people, because of this narrative to say that Hazaras are infidels, Hazaras are kafir, that led to normal people, normal civilians taking up arms and fighting against the Hazaras.
Yeah, so if we go back a little, so at the end of 19th century, the Afghanistan divided in 3 spaces. One is the Darul Islam, which was the territory of Amir Abdurrahman control, and the other was the Darul Ahd, the territory of contract, those who collaborate with Abdurrahman, and the third one was the territory of infidels or Darul Kufr, which was defined. The Hazara people defined as infidel as territory of infidels. So, and then on that time, the Hazara people reduced to the Shia to mobilize the other people to create a kind of religious discussion, and it's continue years and years, more than 1 century. So still, when we think about that, do you think is it a change in this narrative, or still we are at the same unjust narrative in Afghanistan about Hazara people?
Unfortunately, we're still on the same unjust narrative, you know, and this narrative back in the days in 1800s, they used religious scholars to be able to portray this kind of messages. But with the advancement in technology now, they are using social media, they're using madrasas, to be able to continue with this unjust narrative, to be able to continue with these propagandas against the Hazaras, so they can justify the killing of the Hazaras in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there's, of course, there has been many other ways in which this unjust narrative have been able to continue. And one of the, I guess, very effective ways that they've done that is through academics. Historians, they've used their writers, they've in their books, for example, they have the way in which they describe the Hazaras is absolutely wrong. And this is done even to this day. The way that they describe Hazaras, the way that they dehumanize Hazaras in their books is why the continuation of these genocide is happening.
Yeah, so the hate driven ways to the Hazara people still continuing very strongly. So, today also we have the same categorization for Hazara people, the same label. So if we go, for example, into the Afghan narratives, categorizing Hazara as Afghan is also unjust, because it is established in 1942. So before it was Hazara and Pashtun people and Tajik and other ethnicities, and then so the Afghan imposed to Hazara people and other ethnicity in Afghanistan. So, and also when they are talking about Hazara people, they are demonize them, they dehumanize them. As a person, you as a person who engage a lot with Hazara issues, so how we can find this kind of narratives or this kind of image of Hazara nationally and internationally?
Yeah, absolutely right. I think the word Afghan is very interchangeable with Pashtun, right? And this identity was forced on the entire population of Afghanistan. But it is more painful for the Hazaras because this is the identity of the perpetrators, the identity of the people who committed genocide against the Hazaras, who killed 62% of the Hazaras, massacred people, who enslaved the Hazaras for decades and continued the persecution of Hazaras. And now we have to go with that identity. We have to call ourselves Afghan. If not, then you are a traitor to the national unity. And all of this, again, is, you know, this is one thing that, for example, in the past 20 years, the fact that many Hazaras then wanted to be identified by their own identity as a Hazara, which of course every human being has the right to do that. There was a huge campaign against the Hazaras that they are traitors to Afghanistan because they don't want to be called Afghan, right? This itself is a narrative that was used against the Hazaras. And of course, for the Hazaras, especially in the past 20 years, we've seen how different they are to the rest of the Afghan population. And if you want to look back, I think it's important to give a little bit of context here, is that if you, for example, look back at how Hazaras used to live before the genocide, it is very different to how it is now. And there's a specific book that I usually reference is Captain John Wood, in which a book that he published in the 1960s, he described the Hazaras very, very different to how they are now. One of the things that he said was that gender equality was very much present within the Hazara society. He was saying that there are no difference between men and women in the Hazara society, and that women are no shy of strangers, right? And of course, that is something that you don't see in the modern day Afghanistan, because even within the Hazara community, because the colonization and this oppression and this genocide has led the entire Hazara society to completely change, and during that time and after that time, to adapt into this new culture, this new colonized way of living. And now when we look at the Afghanistan, we don't see gender equality, whereas 20 years before the Hazara genocide, we saw gender equality within the Hazara society. And now if you want to look at back in the past 20 years, we have seen Hazaras, how they have gone back into those values. We've promoted education, we've promoted liberty. Hazaras are one of the most progressive ethnic group in Afghanistan. We prioritize education, we promote human rights, women's rights, and we have social liberal values in which the extremist people in Afghanistan, these values is something that they stand against. And that is another factor in which we are being targeted in Afghanistan, and makes us the most marginalized community there. And I think, you know, there's another aspect that I'd also like to touch on, and I think we might be able to discuss this a little further, is the use of Hazara women to demonize and dehumanize the Hazaras. And if we, for example, speak to a lot of women who worked in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, you speak to them, the one thing they say is that the Hazara women are considered as loose women, right? And this is the image that they have given the Hazara woman, which puts the Hazara woman at a much higher risk of sexual violence, sexual harassment, being discriminated against in workplace, not only in private sector, but also in government positions. And this is something that we unfortunately see. And you asked the question whether it has changed, and unfortunately it hasn't. It may have even gone worse, because now that you see a lot of women, Hazara women in society and taking up positions, it has led to more discrimination against the Hazaras, because in a very conservative society in Afghanistan, the men doesn't believe that women to have this position, and Hazara women spearheaded this change, spearheaded the civil development in Afghanistan, and it's something that puts Hazaras even more at risk of persecution in Afghanistan, because these are the values in which, for example, Taliban stand against. So yeah.
So when this unjust narrative created, so Amir Abdul Rahman used the word of Raya Hal Nihai. It is the exact translation of final solution which Nazm used for Jewish people. So, and then they created this kind of unjust narrative to justify the killing of Hazara people. So do you think in today, for example, when they are developing the hate speech against the Hazara people, and use the same terms to, for example, Tajik to Tajikistan, Uzbek to Uzbekistan, and Hazara to Goristan. So is it this same objective in today also for this kind of narrative?
Oh, absolutely. I think you know, the people back in the 90s, when the slogan that they used to shout, Tajiks, Tajikistan, Uzbeks to Uzbekistan, Hazaras to Goristan, which means graveyards. And also there were, the other slogan was that Hazaras either convert to Sunnis or they die. So there was no other option for Hazaras. And even today with the current Taliban regime, one thing that we see is the use of extremist Sunni ideology being implemented in Afghanistan, right? And they are saying that if you don't identify yourself as a Sunni Afghan, then you don't belong in Afghanistan. And this is the type of language that they use in Afghanistan. And of course, Hazaras, majority of the Hazaras are not Sunni extremists. Most of us, we don't identify ourselves as Afghan because we're Hazaras, and that is something that, of course, that doesn't in sync with their ideology, with their narrative, and it just puts us in a huge risk. And this is very, very similar to what we saw back in the 1890s when Amir Abdurrahman Khan gave the final solution for all the Hazaras, and which has led to 62% of the Hazaras being massacred. And unfortunately, this is something that the international community have failed to recognize. And this is something that even in the past 20 years, when the international community were present in Afghanistan, is something that they did not recognize, something that they did not work on, something that one of the biggest mistakes with the international community was that they only dealt with the dominant group in Afghanistan, which are majority Pashtuns. And of course, we all know that the way in which the Pashtuns have always treated the Hazaras were, well, of course, is very evident. But of course, the other thing that happened in Afghanistan in the past 130 years is the suffering of Hazara people were always hidden, right? The way in which the international community, even in the past 130 years, saw the Hazaras was from the very narrow narrative of Pashtuns. And Pashtun, of course, are the perpetrators who committed the genocide, or committing a genocide right now, and the oppressions and persecution of Hazaras. And so even with the presence of the international community in Afghanistan, the way in which the international or the rest of the world viewed the Hazaras was through this very narrative, very narrow narrative of Pashtuns. And even today, that's the same. We don't see any Hazara representation in international dialogue, international conversation, in media, or in the government. And of course, even in the past 20 years, a lot of Hazaras that did occupy some of the positions, especially within the government, were mainly symbolic with no real power. And there is a report that was published by the US State Department in 2017 that actually looks into the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan. And they do say that there are things such as extortion, forced labor, which is a sign of slavery in Afghanistan within the Hazara community, still exist. And they also reiterate that a lot of positions within the governments that are occupied by the Hazaras are mainly symbolic with no real power within Afghanistan. So even the people who worked within the government with no real power were not able to represent the Hazaras when they had no voice and no real power to be able to implement any changes. And therefore, this narrative, or the way in which the Hazara people were portrayed to the international community, was again through this very narrow and very controlled narrative of the dominant group in Afghanistan.
When I was a student, so I had research about forms of narratives in Afghanistan. So I read almost more, maybe 1,000 document and research about that. So I couldn't find anything about Hazara people. So they mostly from dominant perspective or from a minorities perspective. But there is also something about Hazara. There is some short report about Hazara people, but in this report, they tried in the narrative, so they demonized the Hazara people and tried to draw as a kind of negative aspect of society. Or negative aspect of narrative. So so in today, when we go to the social media, when we maybe if we go back before Taliban to this 20 year, which international community come to Afghanistan, so the narrative was the same. So the Afghan government classified Dashti Barchi as a kind of dangerous area, which was not really, because Dashti Barchi and west of Kabul was the only place for young people in Afghanistan who they go there to read poems, to have literature activity, art activity, and it was a very democratic space in compare of other. So how we follow this in different form of narrative? Is it this kind of narrative influence the international narrative also? for example, is it possible that, for example, international media or researcher from other countries to see to the Hazara people from other perspective?
Again, when going back 130 years, especially 20 years, like I said, because the international community were dealing with the dominant group in Afghanistan, as you said, they were portraying the Hazaras as a specific image. And they had a specific controlled narrative about the Hazaras. Example you gave was Dashti Barchi was classified as a dangerous place, where in fact it was the most peaceful place with no internal conflict within the community, where people are the most progressive people. They produce the highest educated students with the highest number of students being able to attend University of Scholars, right? They have the best schools in Kabul is in Dashti Barchi in west of Kabul district. And these are the narrative in which the international community, including journalists, have access to, right? Yes, the use of social media in the past 20 years have been a huge factor in these narratives that the international community have of the Hazaras. But another thing that, of course, in the field of academic, that a lot of international academics have access to and they know about the Hazaras is through the academic books in which Pashtuns publish in Afghanistan. We also have to remember that Hazaras weren't allowed to publish any books for a very long time. And in which that even any historians that published books about Hazaras were also very controlled by the Afghan state. And there's, for example, Hassan Kokar, which is an Afghan historian, still to this day publishes book. In one of his book, he, of course, in most of his book, there's a lot of lies about Hazaras, and there's a lot of ways in which he was, through these lies, he's able to demonize and dehumanize Hazaras. And there's one specific example in which that has been, to this day, very shocking to me personally, because I'm from Jawhari, and in his book he describes there's specific ceremony in Jawhari that is called Krubast ceremony, in which the Hazara, he claims that Hazara men offer their women to guests in this district. And of course, I'm from there. I've been living there for 3 generations, and this is something that is completely untrue and lie. And to say something like this and relate this type of information to an extremist and conservative society, it is the most demonizing thing you can do, to say that there is a society in Afghanistan, there's a community in Afghanistan that offers their women to their guests, right? And this is on academic level. This is the level of dehumanization that happens on academic level, in which then the international scholars, scholars from around the world will then read this book and would think it's true, right? And more importantly, this book is then distributed within the communities in Afghanistan. And this is the sort of image that they will have of Jawhari, when it's completely untrue. Again, because I've been from there for 3 generations. And another lie that he says in his book is that the reason why there are some variety in Hazara features of Hazaras who have bigger eyes or bigger noses, because those women have slept with Pashtun or Tajik men. Again, another lie, and something that if you are, again, this is something that then justifies the sexual violence against the Hazara woman in Afghanistan, because it's something that they can then justify and say, oh, you're used to it because this is what you do and this is how you are, right? And so if this is on academic level, the narrative and the image and the propaganda in which they portray not only to the Hazara, to the Afghan society, but also to the international level. So imagine the negative aspect of it. Imagine the influence they will have on people's minds. And of course, if we go back to social media, they have utilized social media very, very effectively in the way in which they are able to portray the Hazaras in certain image, to say how they are, such, for example, yourself saying that Dashti Barchi is a dangerous place not to go. For example, another narrative that they pushed, in which the international community believed, was that when Alipur in Behzud took up arms and he wanted to defend the Hazara people in Afghanistan from Kuchis and Taliban. He was an anti-Taliban. He was resistant against the Taliban. The Afghan government then labeled him as a terrorist, just so they can dismantle his arm and leave Hazaras completely armless and defenseless against the Taliban. And so again, the fact that the Afghan state for 130 years had access and control in which the certain information can be relayed and portrayed to the international community has had a huge role in which the Hazara community, how Hazara community were portrayed, not only within the Afghan society, but also in the international community. Again, the Taliban are utilizing social media as well to portray their narrative against the Hazaras to the international community. And of course, the fact that the international community fails to engage with the Hazaras also is a factor in which this effectiveness of these narratives being implemented in people's minds plays a huge role.
Thank you. One aspect of this unjust narrative is to limit Hazara religiously to Shia, and also to limit the Hazara geographically in the center of Afghanistan. So the aims of this narrative is to reduce Hazara to religiously to Shia and to center of Afghanistan. But Hazara people are a huge, a big society, so with different religions and in different part of Afghanistan, in Badakhshan, Takhar, Badghis, Hazarajat, and also the historical base was in Maidani Wardak, it was in Nangarhar, so it's based of historical document. So today, I think it's the same narrative is continue to reduce the Hazara people in the Shia people and ignore the, and also to reduce the Hazara people geographically in the center of Afghanistan. So how we, for example, how we maybe demajoritize this kind of narrative, and from which kind of perspective we can create a kind of justice narrative.
Absolutely right. I think one of the other aspect that of these minoritizing Hazaras we saw was when Ghani, regarding the ID card, then he reduced or divided the Hazara ethnic group in at least 11 different sub-ethnic groups within the Hazaras. And the fact that there's no real census has been done in Afghanistan is a way to be able to control this narrative. Because if they're able to conduct an actual census and be able to get accurate information on the population of Afghanistan, they will see that the Hazaras are not the 9% that they claim to be. Hazaras are estimated to be at least 30 to 35% of Afghanistan's population. And the fact that they are portraying, or they have this narrative that Hazara is a minority group is in a way subconsciously is trying to take this power away from the Hazara community. Because if you keep telling people that you're only a minority, you're a small percentage in Afghanistan, you'll start to believe that you actually have no power. And one of the reasons in which they have actively stopped census being conducted in Afghanistan is so they are able to ensure that Hazaras will never be able to gain the confidence and the power to be able to defend themselves. And the reason in which they divided the Hazaras into the ethnic Hazaras into sub-ethnic groups, again, is part of this division to be able to then categorize the Hazaras as Sheikh Ali, even though Sheikh Ali are Hazaras, they after this division, they published a statement to say that they're not a specific ethnic group, they are Hazaras from Sheikh Ali. Sheikh Ali is not an ethnic group, it's a name of place, right? So they have gone to that extent to be able to ensure that Hazaras are seen as a minority, is to be able to control the number of Hazaras, to be able to minoritize Hazaras in Afghanistan. And I think one of the ways that we can try and at least start a just narrative is to ensure that Hazaras are present in dialogues and conversations in all aspects, in all policies within different governments, is for the Hazaras to engage the governments in these policies. I think it's been a little bit way too long for the Hazaras to go unnoticed and their sufferings to go unnoticed, right? If they're able to kill hundreds of people within days, 250 Hazaras died just within 3 days in different attacks in Mazar Sharif, and out of these 126 were school children. And these are all acts of genocide in Afghanistan. And I think this is the time that the Hazaras themselves are able to engage with the governments, engage with the international community, to be able to relay actual information of what is happening on the ground, actual information of who the Hazaras are. We have helped, we supported the international community and their presence in Afghanistan in the past 20 years. You don't see a single shot being fired against the international community from a Hazara populated area. We supported their value, democracy value. We were the ones who gave up our arms and we said, we are with you, and we supported them. And therefore it is their duty to be able to engage with the Hazaras, to be able to listen to Hazaras, to be able not to go and notice of their sufferings, to be able to recognize the Hazaras as a vulnerable group in Afghanistan, is to recognize the Hazara genocide in 1890s, 1990s, and to recognize that there's ongoing genocide against the Hazaras in Afghanistan. And another way that I think is incredibly important is through media and social media. And of course, in the past 2 days, we've had the social media campaign, Stop Hazara Genocide. And this, we saw actual changes being brought in this when we saw certain politicians who firstly denied that this was a targeted attacks against the Hazaras, and after engaging with them, talking with them, and raising awareness about the situation, then they, of course, were then educated and they realized that actually this is not just a target or an attack on education, but actually this was a target against the Hazara community. And I think raising awareness, being able to engage in different dialogues at different levels is incredibly important for the Hazaras to be able to change this narrative.
The demonization or the dehumanization of Hazara people is very, very powerful narrative. Even the school children and the Hazara students, they demonize. So we remember that during the Ashraf Ghani and Hamid Karzai government, so the student of Hazara people demonized, and they tried even to find a way that to create some obstacles and don't allow them to go to the university, and then they started, so we experienced, Hazara people experienced a huge suicide attack in their educational center in Afghanistan. So if we think about genocide as a kind of circumstance, as a kind of situation which comes from unjust narratives, what do you think? Is it, are we in the same circumstance, or is the situation is a genocide situation or not?
It is a genocide situation, and of course the unjust narrative has allowed this genocide to continue, a crime against humanity to continue, this atrocity to continue against the Hazaras. You mentioned that dehumanization of Hazara students. During Ghani government, he put a quota on the number of students from Hazaras that can attend universities, because he saw that the majority of students, for example, in Kabul University were Hazaras, and he didn't like that. He then put a quota on the number of students to limit the number of Hazara students are able to access higher education. And I think to this day, it is. Sorry, I forgot your question.
The question is, if we think about genocide as a kind of situation a process that's create a kind of genocide situation. So it's, of course, it's come from a kind of narrative. So first, it should be started from a kind of justification and creating a kind of unjust narrative. Do you think, the question is, are we still in this circumstance of genocide, or is the Hazara situation is a genocide situation? So, and if it is a genocide situation, and how we can advocate for the Hazara people nationally and internationally. What is the best way to maybe to stay against this kind of genocide process?
Yeah, it is a genocide taking place in Afghanistan. If we look at the definition of genocide by, you know, it does fall under genocide. It is a target against the community for their ethnic identity. To be able to have a just narrative, to be able to portray the actual information, to be able to portray and relay true information of the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan, I think the international community can play a huge role, right? So one of the reasons in which the suffering of Hazaras went unnoticed up until 2001, for example, was because there was a huge control over how Hazaras were able to interact with the international community. Today, we have a large Hazara diaspora around the world who are scholars, researchers, expertise in different fields, especially human rights law, who have access to the international community. And of course, the international community, it is their responsibility to be able to prevent or to stop this ongoing genocide against the Hazaras. And I can't emphasize enough on the international community having a conversation with the Hazaras themselves, right? When the attack against the Abdurrahim Shahid school happened, the international community, international media went on to say this was an attack against education. They did not recognize that this was an attack against the Hazaras. This is the first step, is to ensure that we recognize these systematic attacks are against the Hazaras is a clear evidence of genocide in Afghanistan. They then went on to speak with perpetrators who are anti-Hazaras, from news interviews to the politicians and people who have real power, then going and speaking with the actual perpetrators in Afghanistan, with the dominant group, was then to say their condolences to those people who committed the crimes, the people who had a huge role into the continuation and the oppression of Hazaras in Afghanistan, right? This is, it's, for me, it's absolutely unbelievable for them to, for these people with real powers who have access to the entire Hazara diaspora community, was to sit down, whether it's the politician, whether it's the news anchors, whether it's the media, to sit down with perpetrators to then talk about these attacks. It's absolutely disgusting, and it's not acceptable at all, right? It is real damaging for them not to be able to have the Hazara voices in these platforms. It is incredibly important to ensure that Hazara experience and Hazara voices are represented in all platforms when they talk about issues regarding Afghanistan, because Hazaras have specific problems in Afghanistan. We have specific narratives, we have specific experience that if they allowed the Hazaras to sit in these platforms to ensure that they are able to raise their voice, we would be able to reduce these atrocities a lot quicker and much more. Yes.
So you mean still Hazara people are the target killing, and they are still in the situation of genocide, and the unjust narrative is continuing very strongly. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think when we look at some of the press releases, statements that was published about the attack against the Abdurrahim Shahid school, or the attack in Mazar-e Sharif, this week, and from UN to Human Rights Watch to many other governments, when we read their statement, when we read their press releases, we don't see a single mention of the Hazaras, right? And the fact that they don't recognize these are systematic against the Hazaras is one of the main factors for the continuation of this genocide. And I think the only organization which I saw that they deliberately mentioned the Hazaras was Amnesty International. And I think it's Human Rights Watch, UN's responsibility to recognize that this is systematic attack against the Hazaras. I mean, the UN, when they first published their press release, they said that there's in these attacks in Kabul, during the 3 attacks in Kabul, they said that there was only 6 dead and 11 injured, when in fact we know the number of dead has reached as much as 126, right? And this is the same narrative in which the Pashtuns portrayed, and this is the exact figures that Pashtun had given to their press release, to say that the number of casualties in these attacks was 6 dead and 11 injured. And so we can clearly see that the international community, especially the UN, Human Rights Watch, are not conversing with the Hazaras. They're not recognizing these are systematic attacks, or at least they're not publicly stating that these are systematic attacks against the Hazaras. And the moment you then hide that, and the moment you censor the identity of the Hazaras, it empowers the perpetrators to continue to commit their atrocities against the Hazaras, because they know it is going unnoticed. They know that, they see it as just a violence in Afghanistan, an attack against education, an attack against mosques, when it's clearly an attack against the Hazaras themselves.
So they never recognize Hazara as a kind of target of genocide. So the genocide of Hazara people never recognized, and it's always refused. And so they want to clean the evidence and not accept that they are living in this situation. If I summarize this discussion, so the unjust narrative in Afghanistan started from end of 19th century with the biggest genocide of Hazara people. 62% of Hazara people has been killed between 1892 and 1893. And this kind of discrimination continue in the form of unjust narrative or unjust narrative in different level during the Afghan history. So Afghan history in itself is a kind of unjust narrative, because it's reduced the identity of the multi-identity of people who are living in Afghanistan into one tribe, into Pashtun people. So and then this kind of unjust narrative has a very different negative aspect and influence the life of people, especially the Hazara people. So now when we talk about Hazara people at the national level, so there is not talking about them. So it's just Afghan history. If there is talking, they are just dehumanized and demonized and draw as a negative aspect of Afghan history. And it's also influenced very deeply the international narrative also, because they are the official resource for researcher, for journalists, for those people who are working about Afghanistan. So it's we can see this kind of unjust narrative in BBC very clearly, in Radio Azadi, in Afghan national media very clearly, and also in school textbook in Afghanistan. So there is no talking about Hazara people, and also in universities text also. So it has a huge, and this kind of unjust narrative create a kind of situation that Hazara people become they target killing in a situation of genocide and never recognized what's happened to them. So still those people who has the control of narrative, so they are refusing the Hazara genocide. Do you have something to add, Homira?
Thank you, Asad. Yes, the last point I wanted to add is the importance of monitoring and documenting this situation, the atrocities being committed and these attacks that have been committed against the Hazaras. The Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Organization, they have a responsibility to document and report on these atrocities, especially with the takeover of Afghanistan, the collapse of the civil society, the lack of freedom of expression, the fact that the journalists are not allowed to report on any of these incidents. I think the international community has a responsibility to be able to monitor the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan, to document and report on these atrocities being committed. And I think it's time that they recognize the genocide of Hazaras in the 1890s, 1990s, and to recognize that the ongoing Hazara genocide is happening right now. And last point I wanted to add is that there is an Hazara inquiry which has been launched by British parliamentarians at the moment, where we are looking into the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan. And one of the main aim of this inquiry is to engage the UK government as well as the international actors on what they can do to safeguard the Hazaras in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And also, last message that I have is that the Hazara genocide is still taking place in the shadow of the unjust narrative on a national and international level. And I believe that Freedom Talks provide this opportunity to see Afghanistan from the perspective of the people who are subject to genocide for more than 1 century. So I do, from the bottom of my heart, really thank you for everyone, individuals as well as the organizing party, for this really wonderful and important program that you have organized.
So I think it's time to rethink about alternative narrative, because if we want to stay against genocide, we need a kind of narrative, a multi-perspective narrative, focus on diversity, and to accept different people in this society. So thank you very much, Homira, for joining us into this meeting. Unfortunately, we missed Sajjad Askary, so I hope we can have a discussion with him maybe in the future. Thank you for Teater, Freedom Talk and Safe Haven. And thank you for Munira Hashmi, for very good introduction. So I hope that we as a diaspora find a connection with the country where we live in, to create a kind of alternative narrative and to stay against the unjust narrative. Thank you very much, Homira.
Thank you.